Would you please consider subscribing to my channel and giving my video a thumbs up? I'd really appreciate it.
Once upon a time, in a peaceful village nestled between high mountains and a shimmering lake, there lived a young boy named Leo. Leo was an ordinary boy, much like the other children in his village, but he had a heart full of kindness and a mind bursting with curiosity. However, there was one thing that set Leo apart from the others. He was afraid of many things. He was afraid of the dark, of thunderstorms, and most of all, he was afraid of the forest that surrounded their village. The forest, with its towering trees and thick underbrush, was a place of mystery and wonder for the villagers. They believed it was home to all sorts of creatures, some friendly, some not so much. The villagers told stories about brave adventurers who had ventured into the forest and returned with tales of incredible discoveries. But there were also stories of those who had never returned, and these stories frightened Leo the most. One day, a rumor spread through the village like wildfire. A fierce dragon had been spotted in the forest. The dragon, they said, was enormous, with scales as hard as iron and breath as hot as fire. It had been seen near the edge of the village, scaring the livestock and making everyone anxious. The villagers were terrified, and many of them began to plan their escape, thinking that the dragon would soon attack the village. Leo listened to these stories with wide eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. The thought of a dragon so close to his home made him feel sick with fear. That night, as he lay in bed, he could hardly sleep. Every rustle of the leaves outside, every creak of the wooden beams in his house, seemed like the footsteps of the dragon drawing nearer. But as the night wore on, Leo began to think about the stories his grandmother used to tell him. She often spoke of heroes, ordinary people who found the courage to do extraordinary things. They weren't born brave, they became brave when they had no other choice. Courage, she would say, is not the absence of fear, but the strength to face it. As these words echoed in his mind, Leo felt a small spark of determination flicker inside him. Perhaps he could be brave too. Perhaps, just maybe, he could help the village. The next morning, Leo woke up with a plan. He would go into the forest and find out if the dragon was real. If it was, he would figure out a way to protect the village. He knew it was a risky idea, and he was still scared, but he couldn't just sit back and do nothing while his home was in danger. Leo packed a small bag with some food, a flask of water, and the wooden sword his father had carved for him when he was little. He wasn't sure if it would be of any use, but holding it gave him a bit of comfort. As he stepped out of his house, he saw the worried faces of his parents. They tried to convince him to stay, but Leo stood firm. "I have to do this," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. His parents, though still afraid, could see the determination in their son's eyes and reluctantly let him go. The forest was dark and cool, with beams of sunlight barely piercing through the dense canopy above. Every sound, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, made Leo's heart jump. But he pressed on, gripping his sword tightly, reminding himself of his grandmother's words. After walking for what felt like hours, Leo reached a clearing. And there, in the middle of the clearing, lay the dragon. It was exactly as the villagers had described, huge, with scales that glittered like metal in the sunlight. But something was strange, the dragon wasn't moving. It was lying on its side, its massive body rising and falling with each labored breath. As Leo stepped closer, he realized the dragon was hurt. A large thorn was lodged in its side, and it seemed to be in a great deal of pain. For a moment, Leo's fear returned in full force. This was a real, living dragon. What if it woke up and attacked him? But then he noticed something else. The dragon's eyes were open, and they weren't filled with anger or malice. Instead, they were filled with pain and fear. The dragon looked at Leo, and for a brief moment, they both just stared at each other. Leo's heart softened. The dragon wasn't a monster. It was a creature in pain, just like any other. Gathering all his courage, Leo approached the dragon slowly. He could see the thorn was deep, and the dragon was too weak to remove it on its own. Leo spoke softly, trying to calm both the dragon and himself. "I'm here to help," he whispered, though his hands were trembling. With a deep breath, Leo reached for the thorn. It was tough and deeply embedded, but Leo tugged with all his might. The dragon winced and let out a low growl, but it didn't attack. Finally, with one last pull, the thorn came free. Blood oozed from the wound, but the dragon's breathing immediately became easier. It looked at Leo with what seemed like gratitude in its eyes. Leo stepped back, unsure of what to do next. But to his surprise, the dragon slowly rose to its feet and stretched its wings. It wasn't as large as Leo had first thought. It seemed smaller, almost graceful now that it wasn't lying down. The dragon leaned down and nudged Leo gently, as if to say thank you. Leo couldn't believe what was happening. Not only had he faced his fear, but he had also helped a creature that everyone else was terrified of. The dragon gave one last look at Leo, then with a powerful flap of its wings, it took to the sky. Leo watched in awe as it soared above the trees, disappearing into the clouds. He stood there for a while, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. When Leo returned to the village, he was greeted with gasps and wide eyes. No one could believe that this small, timid boy had gone into the forest alone, let alone that he had faced the dragon. But when Leo told them the whole story, their fear began to fade. They realized that the dragon wasn't a threat. It was just another creature, like them, trying to survive. The villagers were so impressed with Leo's bravery that they decided to hold a feast in his honor. But more importantly, they learned a valuable lesson from Leo's actions. They learned that sometimes, what we fear isn't as scary as it seems, and that courage doesn't mean we aren't afraid. It means we do what's right despite our fear. From that day on, Leo was no longer the boy who was afraid of everything. He was known as Leo the Brave, the boy who faced his fears and saved his village. But Leo knew the truth. He was still the same boy he had always been, just one who had learned the true meaning of courage. And so, the village returned to its peaceful ways, with the villagers knowing they had a hero among them. And whenever they told the story of the dragon and the boy who saved the village, they always ended it with the same words. Bravery isn't about being fearless, it's about being strong enough to face your fears. And so they all lived happily ever after, in a village where bravery and kindness were the most valued treasures of all.